Flight 918 drifted smoothly across the sky, cruising at 36,000 feet, slicing through the upper layers of the atmosphere like a silver arrow guided by invisible winds. Inside the cabin, everything felt calm, predictable, and almost soothing, just the way long international flights usually were. Passengers were scattered across their seats, wrapped in blankets, sipping lukewarm coffee, tapping their screens, and getting lost in their movies or dreams. The rhythmic hum of the twin engines filled the entire aircraft with a soft vibration, like a giant lullaby shared by 300 strangers. In row 22C, a young woman sat quietly, leaning against the window as if she had all the time in the world. Her dark hair framed her face, partially covered by her large noise-canceling headphones. Soft music played, a gentle piece with slow piano notes that blended perfectly with the rhythm of the engines. Outside the window, the sky unfolded in shades of pale gold and icy blue, clouds stretching below her like vast floating continents. She watched them lazily, her eyes relaxed, her breathing steady. To anyone looking, she was nothing more than a typical traveler, a tourist, perhaps escaping into the peaceful scenery 36,000 feet above the earth. Nobody around her had any idea who she truly was. She barely moved during the flight. Sometimes she reached for her water bottle. Sometimes she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music deepen. Nothing about her hinted at anything extraordinary. Even the flight attendants noticed her only in passing. She smiled politely, thanked them softly, and returned to her view. If someone had tried to guess her life story from her appearance, they would have imagined something simple: a student, a photographer, maybe someone returning from a vacation. Nothing more, but the universe has a strange way of revealing hidden truths in the most ordinary moments. Just as the cabin lights dimmed for the mid-flight rest period, a sudden chime echoed through the aircraft. The seatbelt sign blinked on overhead, and passengers lifted their heads with mild curiosity. Usually, such signs came on because of turbulence, but the air felt calm. People looked around, waiting for the captain's explanation, expecting something routine. Instead, the speakers crackled with life, and the captain's voice, usually warm, practiced, and confident, came through with a tone none of the passengers had ever heard before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, but there was a tremor buried under his words, a subtle shake that didn't belong to standard announcements. "If there is any military, trained pilot on board, please notify the cabin crew." Immediately, the sentence hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Every conversation died. Every phone was lowered. Every magazine was forgotten mid-page. Blank stares exchanged across rows. The air felt thinner suddenly, heavier, charged with an unspoken fear. People looked at each other, some confused, some worried, some whispering guesses, trying to understand what could possibly be wrong. What could make a captain ask for a military, trained pilot? Passengers turned toward the aisle, as if expecting someone to stand up. But no one moved. Mothers held their children a little tighter. An elderly man clutched the armrest. A teenager removed his earbuds, eyes wide. Panic hadn't erupted yet, but it lay just beneath the surface, ready to break. In 22C, the young woman didn't panic. She didn't sit upright or gasp the way others did. Instead, she slowly slid her headphones down around her neck. The music faded, replaced by the quiet shock filling the plane. Her eyes remained on the clouds for a moment longer, as if savoring one last second of calm before the storm she had always known would come. She inhaled long, steady, and let out a soft sigh. It wasn't a sigh of fear. It wasn't a sigh of confusion. It was acceptance, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Around her, passengers were still frozen, their attention locked onto the front of the cabin, waiting for someone, anyone, to identify themselves. But the girl in 22C closed her eyes, just for a heartbeat, and in that single blink her entire demeanor shifted. The peaceful tourist disappeared. A subtle sharpness replaced the calm in her posture. Her breathing changed slower, controlled, disciplined. 22,000 feet below them, the world continued unaware of the transformation happening in that one airplane seat. She opened her eyes again, and in that glance there was nothing ordinary left. She gently removed her headphones and placed them in the seat pocket with deliberate precision. Her fingers moved in the same calculated rhythm used by professionals who had been trained to stay composed under threat, pressure, or chaos. She reached for her jacket, not because she was cold, but because she was preparing, mentally and physically, for responsibility she had hoped she would never need to face at 36,000 feet. Passengers near her finally noticed her movement. Some wondered if she was just adjusting herself. Others thought she might be going to the restroom. No one thought she was responding to the captain's call. How could they? She looked far too young, too calm, too normal. But inside her mind, calculations had already begun, thought processes wired by years of training, drills, simulations, and missions never recorded in any public files. She knew what the announcement meant. She knew what situation the pilots must be facing, and she knew they wouldn't have made that call unless the problem was serious, faltering serious. Her heartbeat remained perfectly steady, while the rest of the cabin sat frozen in uncertainty. She quietly unbuckled her seatbelt. The soft click felt loud only to her. She placed her hand on the armrest for balance, stood up slowly, and turned toward the aisle. But before taking a single step forward, she closed her eyes one more time. A moment of silence. A moment to shed the identity she had worn for months. A moment to become who she really was, because she knew without any doubt that the captain's call was not a request. It was a message, a signal, one only she was meant to answer. The girl in row 22C was no ordinary tourist. She was the one the captain unknowingly summoned. She was the one the situation demanded. She was the one the sky had been waiting for. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked nothing like the quiet passenger who had boarded at the terminal. The softness was gone, replaced by a calm intensity that radiated confidence. She took a breath and began walking toward the front of the aircraft, because she knew exactly why she was needed at 36,000 feet, and she knew, better than anyone else on that plane, that this call was meant only for her. The flight attendant approached her with steps that were meant to look calm, but betrayed a nervous wobble that anyone trained could have spotted instantly. Her voice, when she finally spoke, trembled despite her attempt to mask it with a professional smile. "Ma'am, may I know your name?" she asked, as though the entire situation depended on the answer. The young woman sitting in 22C looked up slowly, her expression unreadable, her posture composed with a level of stillness that did not belong to the panicked energy forming inside the aircraft. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag with deliberate, careful movement and retrieved her passport. When she handed it over, it wasn't with the hesitation of a nervous traveler, nor the fear of someone who had something to hide. It was the quiet, controlled gesture of someone who had been asked this question many times in far more dangerous circumstances. The flight attendant took the passport with both hands, as if she knew she was holding something far heavier than a simple booklet of identification, and hurried it toward the purser standing a few rows ahead. The purser, a senior crew member with decades of experience, a woman who had seen medical emergencies, mechanical failures, unruly passengers, and every sort of turbulence imaginable, opened the passport expecting to find an ordinary name, a tourist, a student, a business traveler, someone normal, someone harmless. But the moment her eyes landed on the name on the passport, the blood drained from her face as though her entire body had turned to ice. Her fingers stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. For a second, she forgot she was standing in a crowded cabin. The world around her seemed to stop moving, the sound of the engines fading away until only one impossible realization existed: this woman. The quiet passenger in 22C was someone she had only heard about in whispered rumors among aviation professionals. Someone they told stories about at training sessions. Stories they pretended were exaggerated because the truth was too unbelievable. Yet the name in her hands was unmistakable. The purser lifted her head very slowly, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear, awe, and disbelief. When she finally spoke, her voice came out in a hushed tone, barely more than air. "You're her," she whispered, as though saying the name aloud would activate something powerful. "The one they call Shadow-9." The words seemed to echo, even though she had spoken them softly. The flight attendant beside her gasped before she could stop herself. The two crew members exchanged a look, one that said everything without words. This was not a normal passenger, not an ordinary woman, not even someone mildly important. This was someone whose presence on board meant the situation was far more serious than they had allowed themselves to believe. A ripple went through the cabin even before the passengers knew what the crew had discovered. People sensed the tension. They saw the purser's pale face, the way she held the passport as if it were radioactive, the way she kept glancing back at the girl in 22C with a kind of reverence mixed with fear. Curiosity sparked instantly. In the back rows, passengers started whispering, "Who is she?" Someone murmured. "What's happening?" another asked, leaning into the aisle. Human instinct moved fast, so fast that within seconds half the cabin was buzzing with speculation. Some thought she might be an air marshal. Others wondered if she was a government official under disguise. But none of them were even close to the truth. None of them could imagine the weight of the name printed inside that passport. Shadow-9, a call sign that wasn't supposed to exist on civilian records. A code name spoken only in the deepest corners of classified military communications. A phantom identity used by a woman who had operated in skies nobody else had permission to enter, who carried out missions that didn't appear in any official report, whose expertise was known only by the few officers cleared to even speak her alias. She wasn't just a USAF operative. She was one of the most protected assets within the entire military aviation structure. Someone whose presence usually signaled an international threat, someone satellites moved for, someone whose voice on the right frequency could reroute fleets, activate protocols, and command attention from the highest chair of power. But to everyone on flight 918, she had looked like a simple tourist. The purser took a step closer to her, passport still in hand, trying to compose herself. But the fear didn't leave her eyes. It transformed instead into something sharper, something almost respectful. As she approached, the whispers grew louder behind her. Passengers leaned forward, straining to catch pieces of the conversation. The atmosphere shifted entirely. The cabin no longer felt like a commercial plane. It felt like the prelude to a classified military operation unfolding inside a sealed metal tube 36,000 feet above the world. When the purser finally reached row 22C, she lowered herself slightly, as though instinctively acknowledging the stature of the woman before her. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight, "is this really you?" The girl didn't answer right away. She simply looked up with calm, steady eyes, the kind of eyes that carried stories no civilian mind could process. The kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had stared down chaos at altitude. Someone who understood the fragile, terrifying, and magnificent balance that existed between life and sky. The kind of eyes that did not belong to an ordinary human. The purser swallowed hard. "We didn't expect, we had no idea." Her words trembled. She seemed unable to finish her sentence. Behind her, more passengers were getting out of their seats, pretending to stretch while trying to catch a glimpse of the mysterious woman who had suddenly turned the entire flight into a suspense thriller. Meanwhile, the woman in 22C remained still, composed, almost serene. She didn't deny anything. She didn't confirm anything. She simply held the purser's gaze with a calm that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. It was a silence that carried more authority than any spoken declaration. She didn't need to say she was Shadow-9. Her silence said it for her. A flight attendant standing near the galley whispered to another crew member, Shadow-9, "Isn't that the one whose missions are so classified even the Pentagon doesn't brief the full details?" Another replied, voice trembling, I heard she once flew a damaged aircraft through enemy airspace without instruments. Someone else muttered, the satellite's thing, is that true? The rumor traveled quickly that her call sign alone could trigger satellite recalibration or priority level surveillance. No one knew if it was true, but right now, none of them doubted it, because the woman in 22C didn't need to look powerful. Her presence did it for her. She finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a soft certainty that made the purser straighten immediately. "It's me," she said simply, and the tone of those 3 words changed the entire trajectory of the flight. It was confirmation, permission, and command all woven into a single calm breath. The purser nodded instantly, almost instinctively. She handed the passport back with both hands as though returning something sacred. Her voice dropped even lower. "We need you," she whispered. "Something is happening in the cockpit." The passenger in 22C didn't react with shock, fear, or confusion. She simply took a slow breath and stood up, the entire cabin watching her as though witnessing the rise of a myth. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that she had been trained for this exact moment, conditioned to respond only when the world needed her most. What they also didn't know was that the moment her name was spoken aloud on this plane, the sky above them was already shifting, satellites turning, signals activating, forces aligning. Because when Shadow-9 was identified in the air, nothing remained ordinary. The cockpit was already a battlefield of alarms, blinking lights, and rising tension long before she stepped inside. Red indicators flashed across the instrument panels like warning beacons, reflecting off the windshield as the pilots fought to keep their composure. The radar screen, a round glowing scope pulsing with green arcs, had begun to show a signal that should not have been there, a fast, moving blip closing in on Flight 918 from an angle no civilian aircraft had any reason to approach. The first officer leaned forward, tapping the radar as though hoping it might be a technical glitch. But the signal only grew sharper, stronger, more deliberate. The captain's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the throttles, his voice tense as he radioed ATC for confirmation, only to receive fragmented static in return. Something was jamming the channel, something that shouldn't be able to interrupt a commercial air route. "We have an unidentified aircraft on our tail," the captain said, his tone cracking with pressure, distance decreasing. "We need eyes, we need clearance, we need something." Then he turned to his co-pilot with a look that wasn't fear alone. It was resignation. Whatever this was, they were helpless to counter it. Behind the sealed cockpit door, muffled footsteps approached. The pilots barely noticed at first. They were too busy scanning altitude, course, speed, threat vectors, trying to make sense of the impossible blip stalking them at 36,000 feet. But when the door slid open, the very air inside the cockpit shifted. The noise softened, the tension compressed. The captain looked over his shoulder, expecting to see a panicked passenger dragged in by the crew. But instead, he froze mid-sentence. Standing in the doorway was the woman from row 22C, a passenger he had barely noticed before. But now, in the harsh glow of the cockpit emergency lights, something about her presence made the entire space feel smaller, sharper, more controlled. She stepped inside with quiet certainty, her movements precise enough to rival the trained cockpit crew. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't need it, she simply assessed the instruments, the radar, and the frantic posture of the pilots. Her calmness sliced through the chaos like a blade. Without waiting for invitation, she reached for the spare headset hanging on the back of the co-pilot's chair, a headset reserved only for authorized personnel, and placed it over her ears. The captain watched in stunned disbelief, unable to decide whether to question her or surrender to the strange instinct telling him she belonged here far more than he ever could. Her fingers moved swiftly across the panel, pushing aside a minor set of controls, revealing a rarely used communications module hidden beneath a cover most commercial pilots never touched. A secure frequency terminal, one designed for military override, one the captain didn't even know was active on this aircraft. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" he asked, though the question sounded weak even to him. She didn't turn toward him, she didn't blink. With the confidence of someone who had spent her life doing this exact thing, she dialed a sequence of numbers, an encrypted pattern that looked nothing like any standard aviation protocol. The cockpit screens flickered, as though recognizing her authority, as though something in the aircraft's internal systems responded to her presence. The unidentified aircraft on the radar edged closer, blinking ominously. The captain swallowed hard. "We need military clearance and fast," he muttered, almost to himself, but the woman heard him. She calmly adjusted the microphone attached to her headset and exhaled once a slow, steady breath that seemed to ground the entire cockpit. Then, in a voice that was soft yet carried an unmistakable command, she spoke 3 words into an encrypted frequency that no one else on that aircraft could have accessed. 3 words that did not belong to any civilian dictionary. 3 words that changed the entire dynamic of the sky around them. Shadow-9 requesting escort. The captain froze. The co-pilot blinked at her in disbelief. But the world outside the windshield, vast, black, and indifferent, seemed to react even before the pilots could. The radio, which had been spewing static, crackled sharply as though something powerful had just seized control of the communications channel. The cockpit lights dimmed for half a heartbeat, the air pressure shifted, and then silence, a silence so heavy, so unnatural, it felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. The radar screen stopped pulsing for a split second, frozen on the blip that was closing in on them. The captain didn't dare speak, the co-pilot didn't even move. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fill the room, it swallowed it whole. The kind that preceded decisions made at levels of authority far above the understanding of ordinary humans. The kind that meant something, or someone was listening. The woman in the headset remained perfectly still, her eyes on the horizon, her breathing calm. She was not waiting nervously, she was waiting with certainty, because she knew exactly what those 3 words meant. She knew who would hear them, she knew what would come next. The pilots glanced at each other with panic etched across their faces. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what Shadow-9 meant, and they didn't know whether her presence was a blessing or a threat. But in that deadly 2-second silence, one thing became unmistakably clear. The sky had just shifted into a realm far beyond civilian control. When the response finally came, it was not the voice of ATC, it was not military ground control, it was not any aviation authority the pilots had ever known. It was deeper, older, coded, and laced with a level of power that made both pilots straighten instinctively. But the woman did not flinch, she simply listened because she had called the sky, and the sky was answering. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't static, nor was it the panicked chatter of commercial air traffic control struggling to regain contact. It was a voice so controlled, so unmistakably authoritative, that the air inside the cockpit tightened like a wire pulled to its limit. It was the kind of voice that belonged to the highest corridors of global power, the kind that never addressed anyone directly unless the situation was nothing short of extraordinary. Shadow-9. The voice said, calm as steel, Air Force One acknowledges. F-22 Raptors moving to your position. The captain's jaw loosened, his fingers slipping off the throttle in shock. The co-pilot's eyes widened as though he had just witnessed the sky split open. And in the stillness that followed, the cockpit of Flight 918 felt less like the control center of a commercial aircraft and more like the nerve center of a classified military operation unfolding. My dear. Before either pilot could speak, the entire plane shuddered ever so slightly, a tremor so light it could have been mistaken for turbulence, yet every nerve of the woman in 22C recognized it instantly. She turned her head toward the left window, just as the passengers began gasping throughout the cabin. Something was appearing outside, something no civilian should ever see this close. With a blur of motion that sliced through the clouds like a blade of silver lightning, an F-22 Raptor shot into view, banking sharply before leveling off beside the aircraft's wingtip. Its metallic surface gleamed under the sun, reflecting the clouds below. A second later, out of the opposite window, another Raptor emerged, matching the first one in perfect formation. Two elite stealth fighters escorting a commercial passenger jet at 36,000 feet. The passengers erupted into gasps, whispers, and disbelief. Seatbelts clicked, faces pressed against windows. Phones were lifted, trembling, desperate to record the impossible. "Are those jets?" One passenger whispered. "Are we in danger?" Another asked, voice shaking. "Are they protecting us?" A child murmured, awe overtaking fear. Flight attendants stood frozen in the aisle, unable to speak, unable to move. Their eyes locked on the surreal ballet of military precision unfolding outside the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the captain leaned toward his co-pilot, speaking in a hushed voice as though afraid the sky itself might overhear. "She's not a tourist," he whispered, the words slipping out slowly, reverently, almost fearfully. "She just summoned the White House." He wasn't exaggerating. Air Force One had acknowledged her, the President's Airborne Command Center, the most secure, most powerful aircraft in the world, had responded to her call sign without hesitation. And the F-22 Raptors now flanking Flight 918 were not simply escorting them, they were responding to her. A civilian plane had never been escorted by Air Force One before. It was unprecedented, impossible, yet it was happening, undeniable, right outside their windows. All because the woman in 22C had spoken 3 words into an encrypted frequency the pilots weren't even supposed to know existed. Shadow-9 stood near the cockpit doorway now, her expression unchanged even as the aircraft around her dissolved into awe and confusion. She looked at the jets outside with the calmness of someone seeing old colleagues rather than elite military machines. Her eyes didn't widen, her breath didn't quicken, her posture remained steady, shoulders relaxed, hands still by her sides. To her, this wasn't chaos, it was routine, a procedure, a response she had seen before, a dance she had choreographed countless times. The sunlight struck her face through the cockpit window, giving her an almost unreal glow, half mortal, half myth. She was living proof that the world had layers the average civilian would never understand. Layers where alliances were silent, decisions invisible, and the sky itself obeyed the call of a single operative. The F-22 on the left dipped its wing in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect, recognition, confirmation. Shadow-9's gaze softened for just a fraction of a second, and in that tiny shift the captain understood something astonishing. These jets weren't simply protecting the plane, they were saluting her. Passengers continued whispering in shock, the kind of shock that leaves a permanent imprint on memory. "Is she a spy?" Someone murmured. "She must be military. No civilian can do that. Who is she?" Every guess was wrong. Every assumption too small, but none of them would ever know the truth. Her identity was buried under a mountain of sealed files and redacted operations. She didn't exist in any public database. She didn't have a rank that could be explained. She didn't even hold a title that meant anything to the civilian world. The only name she ever used in the sky was the one whispered in the highest rooms of command, the one the president's aircraft recognized immediately, Shadow-9. The unidentified aircraft that had approached them earlier had already veered away, disappearing into the clouds the moment the Raptors appeared. The threat was gone, neutralized. Shadow-9 didn't look surprised. It was exactly what she expected to happen. She watched the last trace of the unknown blip fade from the radar screen before removing her headset with controlled precision. The cockpit felt different now, lighter, safer, anchored not by the pilots but by her presence. She handed the headset back to the co-pilot, who took it with hands trembling like he was receiving something sacred. She gave a small nod, professional, minimal, final. Her job was done. She didn't stay for praise. She didn't wait for thanks. She simply turned and began walking back through the cabin, moving like a shadow returning to the place it came from. Passengers leaned out of their seats as she passed, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, the weight of what they had witnessed settling slowly into their minds. They would leave this flight carrying a story no one would believe. They would remember the calm woman in 22C. The one who stayed silent while the world raced to obey her. The one who, with nothing more than her call sign, brought fighter jets roaring through the sky to protect them. Today was not a normal flight. Today, history had rewritten itself at 36,000 feet. Today, Air Force One had deployed an escort for a civilian plane because Shadow-9 was on board. And for the first time, the passengers realized the truth. The greatest secrets in the world don't hide underground. Sometimes they sit quietly in seat 22C and watch the clouds.